I don't know. It's hard for me to pinpoint challenges because I never felt challenged, or perhaps like things were negative for me because I was never being kind of victimized or being felt that I was being victimized or felt like I was being discriminated against because I was gay. I always knew that I was gay from a really young age, and I only ever had one incident where my sexual orientation was an issue to other people, whether they knew about it or not. And so I feel like challenges wise, I think it's more things that were for the long run for me. So things like the pressure to come out and have the big coming out and all of the build up that comes with that, and the fallout that you expect coming from that, and the fear that comes associated with that, even when there's no need for that to be a thing. And also, I think not having anybody really to look up to at the time. I kind of didn't find any real role models or icons from the queer community until I was in my teens. And then whenever I found them, the people who I was finding and the content that was coming out, it probably wasn't appropriate or suitable for me at the time because it was it was for older audiences, and I was 14, 15, 16, and so thinking back on it now, while it completely broadened my horizons and I learned so much, if I put another person at that age, I'd kind of think, oh God, they probably shouldn't be watching that now or whatever. But in terms of challenges, I feel like I had quite an open and loved and soft upbringing, and so I never had any of those challenges societally. I never had any of those challenges because I was always a tomboy and around with the boys, and so I was very well accepted because I was always good at the sports and I was good at doing the things. So I'm not sure if challenges would be a word that I would use, but things that perhaps I take with me in the long run, subconsciously, I think is probably more of what I would answer to that. What about you?
I think that's because things have moved on a great deal by the time you were a teenager.
Yeah.
When I was a teenager, my options were just get out of Derry or stay and suffer, and I opted to go. And even that was challenging, because I went to London in 1978. It wasn't as liberal or as easy as people might think, because there was still a lot of discrimination. The 67 Act wasn't actually that old, and there was still a lot of harassment, mainly by the Metropolitan Police.
We're outside now because the power in the whole Derry City is out, but we're in the park, so it's gorgeous. So we'll not talk for too long because we're probably freezing. So I'm going to pass over to you, Jim, because you were talking about growing up or moving to London and your experience with the Metropolitan Police. So do you want to just finish off what you were saying about that?
Generally, I was just saying about how it was different for me and my generation and than it was for you, because by the time you were a teenager, things had developed for the better. But that my option when I was a teenager was to leave in order to survive as a gay man. And that was a good thing to do, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't difficult, because it was difficult. It was difficult being away from home. It was difficult trying to adjust. I was a different nationality, and it was very difficult to find your place. There was a gay community in London, but it was hidden. And even the commercial side of it, which was very limited, was also hidden, literally underground. So you had to work that all out and find it for yourself. But the journey was worth it in the end. And things started moving very fast in my experience, especially from kind of like the mid-80s onwards. So that was my experience of moving, and I never looked back.
It's kind of, I just think that it's interesting that, there's a magpie. I just think that it's interesting how being gay is like one aspect of your life, but as you say, when before I would have known you and others who moved away, I would have thought, God, moving to London in the height of the 70s and 80s must have been so amazing. In London and Manchester, this party club scene, and you had Bananarama and Bronski Beat just playing at your nightclub, and like how amazing that would have been, and you really had your people. But like, I kind of forget them whenever I apply it to real life context, that being gay is only one aspect of your who you are, and so you don't always hit it off with people just because you're gay, because as you say, you're a different nationality, you've got different experiences and different experiences of growing up and all the rest, so you're not necessarily just going to hit it off with people just because you're both gay. So I just think that's really interesting, because there's a lot of gay people that I know but I'm not necessarily friends with, so but I have rose tinted glasses for what I picture your experience to have been, and then I'm sure it's probably likely the other way as well, because we don't necessarily get to have these conversations so often.
Don't get me wrong, it was a great time. You know, those early days in London were great, and what I did discover was there was an awful lot of people, quite a few people from Derry and from other parts of the north, who were there for the same reason. And when it comes to Derry people, I wouldn't really not have known them, but we managed to find ourselves in London somehow, and we became known as on the scene as the Derry Girls long before it was taken over by Channel 4. But remember, there was no social media or anything, so it wasn't difficult. You know, it was difficult to keep in touch and whatever, but when we came across each other, there was this kind of great kind of loyalty between Derry people and people from the north in general. And then obviously when AIDS hit with a vengeance, a lot of those people passed on, and that was also very, very traumatic in itself for a lot of people who survived Derry during the conflict as well. You know, this was more trauma added to that, and I don't think there's been any work done, to my mind, that kind of like looks at the psychological impact on what that was like for us. You know what I mean? It's just another aspect of our experience.
That's amazing. That's like that context as well. Like, there hasn't probably been much work done, or I have actually never heard that perspective, so I would imagine that it's probably not something that's talked about. And like, in my role, we do work around World AIDS Day and reducing stigma around HIV, and we do rapid HIV and syphilis testing, so it's all very proactive and it's all very positive in terms of the language and the terminology that we use, and the because we're trying to shift narrative, but as you say, there's maybe something that has been left behind once we picked up the ball and we ran with it, in terms of saying, let's turn this around and change how people think about it. We kind of maybe missed something there, because we're looking at future generations in the work that we're doing rather than working with the people who have maybe been through some of those experiences, and how do we bridge that gap maybe as well, in terms of the two very possibly different experiences now in terms of HIV and AIDS and those in the world.
I know this is connected in some way to World AIDS Day, and it's still a special day in terms of reflection. But it's not a bad day. You know what I mean? It's a good day in a sense, because there's been so much development, and you know, we don't have a chronic illness anymore. It's, you know, it's our fatal illness. I mean, it's chronic or less, and so I don't really experience any stigma with people who I know who are positive, and I think that's the way it should be, because it's just like surviving any other illness that's out there. But I remember in the early days of the London days, I remember I spent the summer of 1982 in New York City, and when I came back to London, I had exposed myself to something because it was identified as an illness, nothing serious, but because of that, it was suggested by the doctors that I probably had exposed myself to something more serious, and the options at the time were to have a test, but nothing could be done. You know, you died. Well, most people did. So I thought psychologically I'd be safer not knowing my status. And now when I think back on it, the first time I got a test, when people were being saved and when the medicine had developed so far, was 1991. When you think about it, that's a very long time to live without knowing your status. You know, that can play with your head. And a lot of people lived like that, you know what I mean? Lived their lives like they were HIV, but not necessarily being HIV. And that was difficult as well, you know what I mean? But things worked out all right in the end. So, yeah, difficult time.